Hello and welcome to Spare a Thought, the podcast where I interview people and organisations whose work often goes underreported or is misrepresented in the media. I'm your host, Tom Spare. In today's episode, we're talking about universities and climate justice. Today's guest is Jay Chard, who is a PhD student at the University of South Wales, looking at universities' climate change and how universities help with a sort of just transition. In our conversation, we cover a whole range of things. We sort of start with the basics, some of the terminology that often gets misused when talking about climate change and climate justice. And then we move on to a wider conversation about what role do universities play in the transition towards a more climate just world. I really enjoyed this conversation with Jay, and I'm sure you will too. So let's spare a thought for universities and climate justice.
So my name's Jay. I'm a PhD student at the University of South Wales and looking into climate and ecological breakdown, climate justice and the role of universities in kind of just transitions to a happier, healthier and more climate stable world.
Before we talk about universities and climate justice, I'd like to learn a bit more about you. Often at school, there are career days and teenagers are asked what they want to do in the future. When you were a teenager, what did you want to be when you grew up, and have you followed that path?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever really known, to be honest. So I think the question that's really pertinent to me with this is like what is worth doing, and I think I've always been quite driven by that, and I've not always done that. It's not always been possible to do that. Obviously, we all need to make a living and make some money. So I've worked in hospitality or worked in recruitment for a little bit. All sorts of different jobs just to kind of make some money and get by. And then when COVID's hit, I was quite kind of lucky. I had the opportunity, I suppose, to go back to university and do my master's in social science research. So that was really about like trying to find a place where I felt like I was contributing something. I think now we live in quite a difficult time. I think most people would recognize we live in kind of an era of these interlinked civilizational crises. So the rise of the far right and authoritarianism, including like government crackdowns on legitimate protest, almost ongoing, political and economic austerity, cost of living crisis, climate crisis, and ecological breakdown. The list of those things goes kind of on. And to me, I see those as kind of really interlinked in the way that we've built our world and our society and the injustices that it's founded upon. And so for me, I guess it's about trying to find a way to contribute to extricating ourselves and getting ourselves out of that mess. And that obviously looks very different for different people. And I'm still not sure I found exactly the right place.
This summer, we've seen record temperatures across the world, and we've seen it here in the UK, which is part of a growing trend over time. From your perspective, what do you see as the root causes of these temperature rises and the broader climate breakdown? Are they solely scientific, or are the causes of climate breakdowns broader than that?
I guess just to add to the end of the last question, part of answering that question and what we want to be when we grow up is about what the world's going to look like when we grow up, or in the coming years. You're absolutely right that we're seeing record temperatures year on year. So in 2024, so from July 2023 to June 2024, the world was over 1.5 degrees warmer than it was at pre-industrial levels. So we're really at that 1.5 threshold now. Scientists will measure that over kind of multi-decadal time periods, so they're not ready to say yet that we've kind of hit that barrier. But in terms of the actual temperature of the world as a global average over the last 12 to 18 months, we're at that kind of point that was the target of the Paris Agreement to limit warming. So that question that you've asked about what are the root causes, is this just a scientific problem, is really a kind of key debate. And it's a key problem for me here, because I think generally the world sees this as a scientific problem. So global warming, climate change is caused by emissions and CO2 equivalents being released into the atmosphere. And that's scientific, kind of reasonably easily understandable and understood thing. We've got that information from the research that comes out of universities, tells us that that's what's happening. But what's difficult about that is that if that's all it is, then we should be able to just, introduce these scientific answers and solutions. And we're not really seeing that. We're not getting a grip of this problem. Global emissions are rising year on year still. So there's obviously something that sits behind that, and that makes things a little bit more complicated. We can't just apply these scientific solutions or market solutions, because when we've tried to do so, they're not being effective. And also, I guess, we're just continuing to argue over what we can and can't do, and what will affect, what will be effective, what will affect profits, and that kind of argument. To me, those answers in terms of why this is happening lie a lot more in the kind of political, social, and economic realms. So I think the way in which we've built our societies is very profit oriented. So we have this globalized economy now, where the only thing we really measure, the only thing that really matters is GDP, the pursuit of profit motive. And that's true for global governments, it's true for global businesses, and it's also kind of made true for people within society as well. We talked about that, right? We have to be able to make a living, and that comes first and foremost above all of these other things. And I think if that's the only thing that we care about and the only thing that we measure, then that's always going to stand in the way of, and it's always going to prevent us making the kind of changes that we need to make in order to prevent the climate from changing further.
There's a lot of terminology that exists around the climate debate, and it's probably worth sort of diving into it a bit more. So what do you mean, for example, what do we mean when we say climate justice itself, and why is it so crucial to the conversation, especially concerning who bears the burden of climate breakdown?
Climate justice is a term, kind of an interesting term. I think there's some research that shows that younger people in Europe kind of understand climate change as a justice issue, but they maybe never have heard the term climate justice before. It's a term I use because I think it kind of just reorientates our values and the things that we're trying to aim for. So when we talk about climate and ecological breakdown, it often gets talked about as this double injustice. So the double injustice being that the people who are most responsible for causing the climate crisis are the least vulnerable to it, and vice versa. The people who are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change are the least responsible for causing it. So that would be kind of rich nations or the rich within society. The richest 1% of society now account for more emissions than the poorest 66% of people. So when we hear, these kind of faux arguments that this is a global population problem, it's not a population problem, it's a consumption problem, and it's an inequality problem, right? So that's that kind of double injustice. Increasingly, it's being talked about as a triple injustice. So Leon C. Huggins, who's a British Caribbean scholar, will talk about this triple injustice as being those most responsible are the least vulnerable, and vice versa. And then the third thing being that the previous injustices of the colonial world order are what have created those responsibilities and injustices. So the rich kind of developed Western world is rich and developed because of its exploitation of the developing world. And so that puts you in a position where you're not as vulnerable, you're more responsible, and you kind of did all the things previously that have caused those to happen. And then there's another kind of version of that where it's looking at the transition costs. So the richest are the least vulnerable, they're the most responsible, and they're the least likely to bear the burdens of transition. They're more likely, if you're already rich, you're more likely to profit from transition, and the most vulnerable in society and in the global population are the most likely to kind of lose out in those transition costs. So we need to be really careful. We talked about that, that was our last conversation there, was about, how do we kind of move at pace? How do we install these things without the burdens being borne by the poorest and the most vulnerable in society? There's also different ways that climate justice gets kind of operationalized, and it has kind of three sort of main bases in the places it's talked about. So one of those is within international politics, and you have seen in the COP processes over the last couple of years, that's been really dominated by this kind of loss and damage agenda. Loss and damage is developing countries or climate vulnerable countries asking for financial reparation from the global north for the losses and the damage caused by climate change. But that's really a conversation that's had in almost exclusively in financial terms. There's a basis of climate justice that comes from activism, where it's kind of born from and kind of moving on the conversation around environmental justice. So that environmental justice movement is really quite kind of localized, started in America in the late 1970s, 1980s, and looks at how kind of land use, how, pollution and things like that are put into poorer neighborhoods or black neighborhoods originally. And climate justice kind of expands on that and understands that, we're now seeing the imposition of climate solutions put onto those poorer neighborhoods. So things like rich Western companies buying up forest land in Africa in order to offset their emissions, and that land then being denied to local populations, things like that. And then the third place it's used is academically. So all sorts of arguments within academia about what climate justice does mean, what's included, what isn't included. And I think the thing that's important to understand is the different people that we think justice is owed to, or the different kinds of justice that we talk about, really impact upon what we think of as climate justice. So there are arguments that say that, we can have climate just solutions where everyone in the globe gets a global hectare's worth of emissions. Everyone has an equal amount of emissions they can emit. And that would be just because it's entirely equal. But that allows then, doesn't account for previous inequalities and what people have actually available to them. It allows those with more resource now to buy those global hectares from other things, right? So there's a fundamental problem with that, but that's a version of justice. There are others that say, we can have climate just solutions now by borrowing from future generations. So if you accept the idea that the economy is going to continue to grow into the future, which I think is a really dangerous assumption. But if you accept those kind of, neoliberal assumptions that the economy is going to continue to grow, what you're borrowing from future generations in order to pay for the globe we live in now is a minuscule amount of money, and therefore you can just borrow from future generations, and that would be a just approach. So you have to be really careful when it comes to climate justice in terms of who's included and who's excluded. The way I tend to use it is as this kind of this transformational kind of paradigm shift about what we value in society. So almost as a kind of alternative future to this kind of neoliberal free market world that we live in now that values profit over people and planet. I would say for me, a climate justice approach is about changing those goalposts. So understanding what are the kind of things we need to live, in a future that's kind of climate stable, but also happier, healthier, and more just for everyone that lives on the planet.
You mentioned COP. What does COP stand for? Not everyone will necessarily know.
It's the kind of international Congress of Parties. I forget that every time, but it's the International Congress of Parties. So we're now up to COP 2029 this year, last year. I've lost count. I suppose that's one way in which I would say that the status quo approach of looking at how we manage climate change is not getting us to where we need it to be. That COP process, we did have the Paris Agreement come out of that. We did have signatories from around the globe to the Paris Agreement, which was to limit global warming to 2 degrees with a target of 1.5 degrees of warming. But those international agreements aren't enforceable, and there's nothing to kind of, you can agree to them, but there's nothing to actually kind of enforce countries to get there. So the agreements that we have coming out of COP, aren't sufficient to reach those targets, and B, they're almost exclusively not being met. I don't think there's a single country in the world that's actually on target for a 1.5 degrees of warming, and that's not globally. That's within each individual country. The problem we have with those kind of net zero, I suppose if we talk about the net zero concept of net zero as well here, because that's how the kind of COP targets get institutionalized is trying to reach net zero. So within the UK, we have a target for net zero by 2050. And the UK government will say that we're 50% down on 1990s emissions today. And that sounds kind of good. And it sounds kind of like we're on the way towards something. I suppose there's 4 major issues that I've got that come out of that net zero approach and the kind of COP approach to to how we reach these targets. So the first of those is that they're net targets. You don't actually have to reduce the emissions. You have to reach a kind of net target of reducing emissions, but also offsetting the emissions that you do reduce. So that might be by buying kind of forestry area in the developing world, or it might be by investing in unproven kind of carbon capture and storage technologies, which, at the moment it seems like those technologies will cost more in carbon than they would ever be able to remove from the atmosphere. But that net element gives a real out to those businesses and those countries that can afford to kind of say, oh, we're investing in this technology, or we're investing in these kind of natural solutions without ever actually reducing their emissions. That's true at international, national levels coming out of COP, but it's also true within businesses and universities, as an example. Those net zero targets aren't particularly just. So if the UK has a net zero target of 2050 and the Maldives have a net zero target of 2050, there's a kind of egalitarian approach there where like we have an equal amount of the carbon budget to continue to use up. But the UK is far more developed off of its previous emissions. It has far greater capacity in order to adapt now. And so its targets should be more ambitious than that 2050 kind of egalitarian way of looking at things. There's a question about what these net zero targets measure. So this becomes a real kind of managerial approach where we're measuring scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are kind of the actual emissions that come out of the operation of your business or of your country. Scope 2 emissions are about supply line emissions and inputs into that. And scope 3 emissions are about kind of everything else associated. And generally we're measuring scope 1 and 2 emissions here, and we're saying we'll reduce those. Now, on an international level, that means the UK can say we're 50% down on 1990s levels, but we can just export emissions elsewhere, right? If we produce goods in China, those are no longer a UK concern, even if they're consumed and used in the United Kingdom. And at a university level or a business level, if we're not including scope 3 emissions, we're not including like flights for international students, which is obviously a huge, that's the business model for universities in the UK these days, is to attract international students. And if we're not accounting for the kind of flights and the things that the emissions that occur that aren't directly as a result of university education, then we're missing a huge slice of the pie there that's just not accounted for at all. And then the fourth thing about these kind of net zero approaches is that we're just not going to meet those targets. So I think there was an announcement from or a news story out of Bristol the other day. So the city of Bristol had a net zero target by 2030, and there was a news story that that's just not going to be met. And if you speak to people behind the scenes in universities, certainly with the latest round of cuts and austerity, I think there's pretty widespread understanding and agreement that we're just not going to hit these net zero targets. So yeah, 4 kind of major problems there coming out of that international political managerial approach to this problem.
What's the best way of sort of describing what in a sentence or two what a just transition is?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned transition when we talked about climate justice, but that kind of third level of injustice of climate change, but it's really about where the costs of a transition are borne. So are they borne by the most vulnerable and the poorest in society? And it sort of includes another population there, which is the working class, I suppose. So in Wales, we can take the steelworks as an example. In Portalda, a lot of good and well-paying jobs in the steelworks that, as we transition away from a kind of fossil fuel intensive economy, we want to make sure that those jobs aren't lost, that those skills are recognized and are kind of transitioned into something that could be used, or those workers are reskilled. So it's about making sure we don't leave people behind. We don't leave people without kind of well-paying work or without a kind of future in that new economy.
Could you sort of talk about the distinction between climate mitigation and climate adaptation?
Yeah, so climate mitigation is about preventing climate change from happening to the greatest extent that we can. So I mentioned that Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees. I think it's important to recognize that those aren't hard targets. Like it's not just if we miss 1.5 degrees, we should give up and that's the end of everything. Like every degree of warming that we can save here is valuable and will prevent kind of mass death and mass displacement around the world. So mitigation is about efforts to prevent climate change from happening. Adaptation is about adapting to the effects of climate change that we're already seeing and that we will continue to see. So adaptation might look like the building of seawalls to protect a city from sea level rise, or it might look like, you know, relearning how to kind of grow our own food and garden and things like that. And there is a real kind of approach to this, which has given up on mitigation and doesn't believe that we're going to be able to make the changes we need to make. And so this kind of deep adaptation approach, or almost the climate kind of doomer approach, which is, you know, look after me and mine and those skills. The thing I'd say about them is that it's really important that we do both. We live in a climate changing world already. We are going to have to adapt to a new climate, and that's going to be incredibly costly. And the less mitigation work that we do, and the less that we invest in mitigation efforts, the less effective our mitigation efforts are, the more costly that adaptation is going to be. So, for example, if the jet stream collapses, so there's predictions the jet stream could collapse as early as 2025. Even if it's not on that timescale, if the jet stream collapses, the UK is looking at a climate more similar to Canada, where we have these really cold winters, really warm summers. We simply can't handle that with the infrastructure we have. So I suppose if you think about the cost of that without any mitigation to prevent it is extortionate.
Adaptation could be as extreme as moving entire communities right away from beyond building seawalls. It might even be letting coastlines change and moving whole communities away and further inland or to higher land. Yeah. And also, again, it's that it comes down to that, the honesty part of our leaders, where it's like, okay, we can stop doing these things for mitigation and we can give into that narrative that this is costing us too much, but it will cost us even more.
Right.
And I suppose it comes back to that thing of being led by quite elderly folks who, in all honesty, isn't their problem anymore. You know, they've had their life, and you know, and that's it. And there's a lot of nationalists out there who are saying, well, it's going to cost us too much to mitigate, so we'll just sort of let it happen.
I mean, that's the other thing for me, is I just think there's a real kind of dearth of political leadership on this issue, and it's fundamentally it's dishonest of these, you know, kind of authoritarian, this kind of rising authoritarianism. So there's a lack of political leadership from the status quo. I think we're seeing that in the demise of the Conservative Party, but also now of Labour in this country. And then there's a real dishonesty about the people that are kind of currently filling that void. There's a real kind of eco-authoritarian approach, which will be to kind of shut down borders and look after our own and blame migration and things like that. None of which addresses the real problem that we're facing here, and the fact that we don't have a choice about investing in this. Like if we don't do it, the effects will continue to grow and to rise, and the infrastructure will continue to be, you know, more and more inappropriate for the climate that we face. And the other thing I would just say on that distinction between mitigation and adaptation is we are in the UK quite insulated. So we've talked about the injustice of the resource we have available to us and what we can afford in terms of making those changes. And we can talk about how, I don't know, extensive it's going to be to retrofit housing and things like that. But in other parts of the globe, the effects will be far more severe. You know, so we're looking at mass displacement and mass death and the inability to grow crops and all those kind of things. So the effects elsewhere in the globe are going to be far more, I don't know, felt far harder, I suppose, our doorstep as well. And we have a choice about how we want to engage with that. Do we want to engage with that in a kind of just way, or do we want to shut down borders and turn our back on? You know?
Yeah, and obviously you've got the things like, you know, island nations in the Pacific, for example, that will be underwater within a given period of time, or just not inhabitable. And I guess to move on from that, let's talk about universities, because, you know, universities are places of education and scholarship and research. And what role have they played in shaping the narrative around climate change? And I guess what are they, you know, doing now to shape it? And yeah, let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so universities, I think, they're just a really interesting kind of institution. I think they're very different from from other social public institutions that we have. Stefan Collini describes them as curious institutions, which I think is interesting given their kind of complexity, but also fun given their kind of complexity, but also his interpretation is that they provide this kind of partly protected space in which trying to extend and deepen human understanding has priority over any other purposes. And universities are the only institutions where pursuing that kind of thinking is not subordinate to any other purpose. So thinking differently about humanity and the human condition or the world or whatever it might be is really the purpose of, and has been or should be the purpose of, universities. We're obviously entering a time where that is subordinated behind another purpose, and that, I guess, we'll talk about that, but we've already spoken about, profit and austerity being a purpose that's kind of subordinating those interests at this time. And historically, so universities have obviously, they've provided the research that tells us about what climate change is like. They educate our population. They provide skills and jobs and work and all these kind of things. They've done some really positive things. Students have been at the forefront of protests for climate action, ongoing kind of protests and demonstrations and things like that about what is required. So things like fossil-free careers and fossil-free research. Our student movements, I guess, shout out People and Planet as an organization, that student-led organization that's run really successful campaigns to get fossil fuel money out of universities. But they also have had this really damaging role as well, both historically and today. So students protesting to get fossil fuel money out of research is because there's so much fossil fuel money in research that has greenwashed for years and years and years, that has greenwashed the images, but also the role of fossil fuel companies who've known for a long, long time that this is happening, that they're causing climate change, and that have spent a lot of money trying to kind of muddy the water there and delay. And universities are complicit in that, in taking money from fossil fuel companies. Imperial College London announced, just the other day that they're going to continue to work with Shell and ExxonMobil. This is after they've pulled out of these kind of science-based alliance. Imperial's kind of imposed their new Imperial Zero Index, what the kind of rigorous framework looks like about who they work with. Because the previous framework, these companies no longer met it, they would have had to reduce their fossil fuel expansion, and they don't want to do that. So they've pulled out of that, and suddenly Imperial comes up with a new metric to measure this. Right. This is kind of, it's greenwash. I mean, it is what it is. We know what it is, but universities are complicit in continuing to take that money. And there's reasons why they do that. They're obviously in a really difficult position financially at the moment. Historically too, though, I suppose, just in terms of the climate justice kind of angle and the way that the structures of global society, there was a report from the University of Edinburgh the other day to say that the university had an outsized role in propagating these kind of pseudo-scientific racial theories that have underlied, colonialism and racism, structural racism in the past. So universities, again, like their relationship with power, with the state, with, I guess, previously religious institutions, in terms of like insulating elite power and in terms of training the people that went out and ran the colonies for the British Empire. They have they're really implicated in the way that the world's been built in a really unjust way. So interesting institutions in that they do both, and their relationship with power has always been very complex. Going back to how Stefan Collini describes them, but he says they almost sign this kind of Faustian pact with society. So universities are given the freedom to pursue learning and knowledge. They're given the freedom to kind of do these kind of practical things that society needs them to do. But in doing those, they'll always kind of subvert those purposes, and they'll always look beyond them and question and challenge those purposes. And I think it's really important that we have that we encourage that we continue to push and to challenge. And universities know that, they, more than any other place in society, they have the knowledge and the understanding of what is happening with climate change and an ecological breakdown. They understand it better than anywhere, and yet they continue to act as if the effects aren't real, as if money and the financial obligations they have are real barriers to any kind of change or action. But the climate research and things that tell us the world's going to be a very different place almost takes a backseat in those kind of policy judgments.
I suppose it's also like what sort of theme of this season of the podcast is really about imagining the future, and universities should be, have the capability of doing that in terms of foresight, but also technology and technological development, and the incredible expertise that exists, across even just one university. Even if you were to take Cardiff University, incredible expertise that exists in engineering or mathematics or computer science or wherever, in philosophy and in the languages and so on. There's always been that tension between universities, its civic mission about how to help its communities versus, giving back to the economy. Universities UK will always publish reports every year. Well, universities give back to the economy however many billion, international students give back however many billion, employment and so on. But then also they sort of almost shield that and then get on with a load of other stuff with the other hand and take from the other hand. Can you give any examples of where universities are doing well in this realm, and then in terms of tackling climate change, and then others that maybe need quite a lot of improvement?
I suppose there are a few examples. So things like the University of Barcelona have mandated mandatory modules for all students that attend the university on climate change. Similar things, and different ways of instituting this, but similar things at the University of San Diego in California. We do have in the UK, there are kind of alternative higher education provisions like Schumacher College and Black Mountains College, which is starting up not far in mid Wales and Krakow, looking to address this problem kind of head on and build skills and critical thinking and understanding. Some criticism there that again, they're quite elite institutions and they're expensive to attend, and the people they attract tend to be kind of white and middle class. So again, just need to be kind of careful about who's included and who's left behind with these kind of approaches. In Ireland, there's a Climate Justice Universities Alliance. So that's a group of universities in Ireland that are coming together to think about and to talk about how we do better than we are. But I think I'd say the general kind of state of play is pretty kind of status quo and continues to use sustainability agendas to, meet what students want and be seen to be doing the right things. I think universities tend to generally focus on their kind of estate's emissions. So, what are our buildings emissions and things like that. And it's obviously important that they lead on those things, but it means they leave behind the research elements and learning from their own research. It means they leave behind the educational elements, and they have these kind of sustainability strategies, but they talk about sustainability as allowing them to kind of continue to do their job, which is to attract students. And so I think they're in a really difficult position financially. I think they've been put in a really difficult position by the kind of UK policy environment, which has really restricted their funding and the freedom that they have. But that has a really homogenizing effect. So the kind of elite institutions are doing okay and they can continue to do their things. That's really Oxbridge in this country, and everyone else is kind of struggling and so doesn't want to step outside of the status quo. And generally that means that they're kind of, we're seeing it at the moment. We're making staff redundant, reducing the offering of universities and reducing them in such a way that, valuable courses and valuable critical thinking is being lost. And these kind of larger cohorts of economically valuable, jobs focused cohorts are kind of being put through. And that works for an economy that we have today, or we can argue whether it works for that or not. I think it reduces the quality of education that you get actually, and reduces the quality of graduates and therefore the quality of people in the workforce. But yeah, we can kind of talk about whether that has value for the economy today, but the reality is that isn't the economy of tomorrow. And then the next kind of 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 to 25, as we look into the future, universities need to do a much better job of understanding the world is going to look different, and the skills that are required of its graduates are going to look very different. And I think, like you said, like looking at the future, we've talked a bit about what the future's going to look like. We can see a future of climate breakdown. We can see what it looks like if we don't get a grasp on this. We can see a future of kind of eco-authoritarianism and shut borders and war and famine and mass migration. We understand what those look like as kind of perpetuations of the continuation of the world as we see it today. And I think what we don't have a great view of and a great understanding of is what the alternatives are. Like, how can we institute these transformative changes? How can we start to put people and planet first? And how can we kind of create the financial investment in these changes for a world that we actually want to live in and we actually want to see in the future? And I think universities obviously have a key role to play in creating that and producing that.
Yeah, exactly. I think if we focus on from that, you've mentioned a lot about the future. I think we should probably focus on that, although briefly acknowledge, because I think profit in education is probably a whole episode in itself. But it's making clear that universities are in a difficult financial position at the moment, because of a whole number of factors. The cost of living, how much it costs to fuel university, energy costs and all that sorts of thing. But then also, staff needing to be paid more to reflect that inflationary costs. Supply chain issues. You've got Brexit as well, and funding from leaving the European Union and then coming back into the European Horizons project, which is funding for universities. Availability of international students and over-reliance on them, as well as sort of a number of other factors too. So then as a result, universities, because of lack of government intervention, UK government, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, not willing to intervene and to provide a vision of what universities are for from a state sort of driven perspective, has led universities to make some poor short-term choices. And that also is linked up with their governance as well. There's not enough accountability of how universities are run, in part, and I think we've discussed this before, because of a lack of collective student movement in students' unions, not being as powerful as they used to be in the National Union of Students. So I think it leads to universities really just looking at their profit margins and saying, well, how do we stay afloat for another year or another 2 years or another 3 years? And on top of that, very expensive pension schemes, which again are investing in, the largest pension scheme for universities, which is linked to Russell Group institutions. I think were at some point in the last couple of years the second biggest investors in Thames Water, for example. So you've got literally a lot of money going down the drain, and so you've got all these factors together, which mean universities are, for example, their investments are linked to fossil fuels. They are linked to weapons companies. They are linked to lots of these other things. Have you got any other comments apart from that, or shall we focus sort of on that?
I think that's a really good rundown. I think you missed anything. I think it was pretty comprehensive. I think what I'd say there is, so how do we draw that back into something that we can actually address? If you speak to kind of leaders within the university management, they'll say, well, we're contractually obliged to make not to make a loss, right? We can't not make a loss. So that's a real barrier that we have, and we have to make sure that we make these cuts, or that we have these relationships with industries that we don't want to have, because we will lose our jobs or the university will go bust or things like that. So that, to me, the question becomes there, like, more about how do we value these things as public institutions, and how do we move away from this austerity understanding, neoliberal understanding of everything has to pay for itself. Universities in the UK adds, I think the number's over 100 billion to the UK economy every year. That their value is not in running day to day to a profit. Their value is in educating their students and the research they produce and the things. So universities have always had a kind of quite indirect relationship with value, with economic value in terms of the output. that doesn't mean that value isn't there. It just means it isn't measured in kind of daily profit and loss accounts of what's coming in and what's going out. I think a really good example of things like that is to look at sports teams. Like you don't value sports teams based on their profit and loss sheet day to day, right? Nobody would be interested in owning Manchester City or whatever if it was about how much it costs to run on a day to day basis. You value them in terms of the value of the franchise there in sports sense. In universities as well, we need to have an understanding where we value them as their value back to society, and a more indirect understanding of that. And you mentioned, I think there are all sorts of different things that we can talk about in that way. You mentioned Thames Water, right? Like there are all sorts of conversations that we can have in that sense. But that comes back to this question of, okay, like how are we making decisions? How are we running society as a whole? And it's not to say that those things are easy for people. It's easy to talk about like a leadership. I think there is one, but also there are real restrictions that are placed on people in those positions and the decisions that they're actually able to make. So unless we're able to have a discussion as a society about what we value and how we value it, it's very difficult to kind of find the way through or think about that differently.
And I think also there's a real lack of alternative options. So in the university sector, there are private institutions. I mean, Richmond University in London, and you've mentioned a few. The one in Wales I wasn't aware of, but they often go under the radar because their quality and the educational assurances that apply to most universities often don't apply to them. So they're able to go a bit more under the radar and do things differently. In the same way, accountability for NHS hospitals is very different to accountability of private hospitals, for example. And so, we've got this problem. But also in other countries, you have the option of going to your local institution, your local university that won't cost as much versus, in the United States, if you stay in state, it doesn't cost as much as if you were to go out of state. So that's sort of an implication as well, is that there isn't really a choice. We either go to very small number of very expensive institutions, or not even like for the public goods institutions. They're still expensive to get into, very expensive to be a student, and also they're not efficiently run. They're very expensive to run. If we go on to the final question, then looking at 10 years down the line, how does the role of education and specifically universities need to shift in a world grappling with escalating impacts of climate change versus a world where we've proactively embraced ambitious climate action, truly prioritizing people and planet? And I guess from there, what kinds of curriculum and graduates would we need to build that for a more healthy, equitable and climate stable future?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think the first thing I'd say is we don't have a great idea of what that looks like. And I think it's part of the job of universities to offer those options, not just within the university sector, but to society in general. So I'd like to see them really engage with this question of what the future is and really work within these frames of what the world is going to look like. We talked a lot about, the financial situation, but I think currently universities are very much headed in the wrong direction of like large cohorts, streamlined cohorts of without any kind of humanities or any kind of critical thinking, but really just preparing people for a job market that we've already said is not going to look the same in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. We do have lots of, kind of options and ideas and things. These are kind of are suppressed behind this neoliberal austerity politics that we seem to think is the be all and end all of the way that human society can be structured. So the first thing that they need to do is try and find ways to extricate themselves from that as much as possible. That's really a financial consideration, but that might come down to, as I said, the kind of wider public valuation of these institutions as valuable public institutions, how we choose to fund them, that kind of allows them to free up again and stop worrying so much about this day-to-day cost balance sheet and actually worry about what the education is we're providing to people. From a research perspective, I think we need to look towards kind of exnovation rather than innovation. So how do we kind of extricate ourselves from these harmful technologies that we're currently reliant upon? And that doesn't mean that we can't come up with new ways of doing things and new kind of innovative ideas, but it means understanding that rather than trying to consistently look inward and innovate and create new technologies, which all have this huge carbon cost and a really kind of unsure future as to what they are going to provide. It's more looking at a kind of wider picture of, okay, here's the situation now, and how do we kind of, what technologies do we need to extricate ourselves from that? And what strategies, what kind of social, cultural, economic strategies do we need to exnovate our way out of this? We need degrowth from these kind of harmful industries, say fossil fuel extraction. We know we can't afford to continue to do that, so we don't need to be researching further, into that. Things like aviation, which are, hugely influential within the university sector in terms of training of engineers and innovation within that sector. We need to understand that, any move to kind of hydrogen planes or anything that's going to, not result in a degrowth of that sector is going to cost the entire remaining carbon budget to get to. So we need to understand that there are certain ways we can think about this that are viable, and certain ways that we think about this that, shouldn't really be making it through a kind of university ethics panel because they're not a viable kind of future. That includes removal of all fossil fuel interests from universities. It's not reasonable that we have these kind of private interests directing university research and university education in a way that is greenwashing their image and is really harmful. And then I guess it's things like, becoming more these kind of anchor institutions within their local communities and providing skills and training and, the resources and the things that universities do well, making sure that they actually benefit local communities. There's a real kind of gap, this town and gown gap between local communities and universities. So we need to see this kind of growth in useful skills and critical thinking and the kind of things that we need to happen to create this transition. So heat pump installers or renewable energy skills, those kinds of things as well. I think to boil all that down, it's about learning from their own research and understanding, we've put this understanding of what the future is going to look like into the world. And we need to become these institutions of kind of wisdom rather than knowledge. So knowledge for knowledge's sake doesn't require you to act any differently off of the knowledge you've created. But if you become or try to become this kind of wisdom institution that learns from its own understanding, hopefully that pushes you in a slightly different direction. Jenny Stevens, who has the Climate Justice Universities book, says they have a role to play in opening the plurality of futures available to humanity. And I like that as a kind of guiding principle of what universities need to do and the role they should play in society is show us these other options, inspire and provide a kind of hope that we can move towards, a better world and a better future than the ones that we've outlined in this conversation.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's a good way to sort of end. Really, is that you can create, universities have the ability to create a plurality of futures, which isn't sort of end of worldy timey one. It could be other options too, and it's a bit like, for me, it just sort of reminds me a bit of one of the Avengers films and the Marvels where Doctor Strange is basically, there's only one option and that's to do this one thing, but actually instead we could create other options too. This brain is bonkers. They're the main sort of things, but it's great. We've had this discussion because I think it opens up. There's a wider complexity, and what role universities play is really important. And part of that is universities themselves, but also the other element is, what role government takes or wants from universities. And that's not been very clear, particularly over the last 15 years. And it's bonkers to me that universities aren't clear on it because they're so important to an industrial strategy. They're so important to the development and protections against artificial intelligence. They're so important about healthcare and the training of healthcare professionals. They're so important about general educational levels. And also going back to an earlier conversation we had about basically Britain's education being very qualified folks across the country but not necessarily qualified in the areas that we need them to be qualified in. So we need a space both for learning's sake, but also building up and filling in skills gaps that exist in our local communities, right, which will help with the mitigation against climate change and also adaptation as well. Because if we don't have the trained, skilled force to build and innovate, then again we're sort of in a bit of trouble.
The universities haven't even really done a lot of the work yet, or society hasn't even really done a lot of the work yet in terms of what those things are, what they look like, what those skills are, what the strategy might be. And I think that's because we haven't got a grip on this understanding of what's causing this problem. If we continue to see it as a scientific thing, we can grow the economy out of this problem, and we can rely on these future technologies that aren't proven. And we're all told that that's going to be a way out of this, and I don't think that it is. And so I think we all need to be thinking very differently about it. That's universities and society in general. And so I suppose that's what I'd say to anyone listening to this conversation is like, how do we see that future? How do we see a world out of it? And what are the kind of things we need to do? And how can we work to get there? The barriers are substantial. The financial costs are difficult and substantial and made very real to us as a barrier to doing anything differently. But we need to start to find ways around that and through that.
Thanks, Jay, and thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.
And that was the latest episode of Spare a Thought, where we spared a thought for universities and climate justice. My thanks to Jay Chard for being such an excellent, generous guest and for sharing his time and his thoughts on the subject. This episode has been part of a wider series about educating for the future. You can hear previous episodes looking at how we get kids into STEM with Chris Thorpe, and Phil Baker's of the Future with Sam Cullis. At the next episode of this season, episode 4, I'll be looking at how do we create a mattress-centric future with Sinead Ali, really good friend of mine, and we have an excellent conversation about her new yoga studio that she's opened up on Woodville Road, the festival that she ran this summer for the second year in a row, and lots more. So I look forward to sharing that conversation with you. The music for this show is Young Shall Grow by Asha Jane, Magugu and Afro Cluster. This episode was recorded, edited and produced by me, Tom Spare. Spare a Thought is a Be The Change Media Network production. Thanks for listening.
Whether you like them or not, young shall grow. Better fill them with love. Then them to know in this life you don't give up. Even when you know, if you fall, get back up. Young shall grow. Whether you like them or not, young shall grow.